In the twilight of World War II, as the Allied forces advanced through Europe, a sense of desperation enveloped the Third Reich. Confronted by relentless military pressure on multiple fronts, the German command sought a technological miracle to reverse their fortunes and restore a sense of dominance. It was during this tumultuous period that the V-2 rocket was conceived, heralded by German engineers and military planners alike as a weapon that could potentially alter the outcomes of the war. The development of this advanced ballistic missile would not only embody a leap in engineering prowess, but also a strategic shift in warfare, aiming to strike the enemy deep within their own territory without the hindrance of traditional aerial delivery systems. The V-2 rocket, with its unprecedented speed and range, was designed to reach targets at distances exceeding 300 kilometers, targeting the heart of cities and instilling fear in the civilian populace. Originally intended as a means to target military installations, the first launches quickly revealed the unintended consequences of this devastating technology, as the civilian targets of London, Antwerp, and other cities soon became the preferred objectives of the Nazi regime's retribution. The drive behind the V-2 project was spearheaded by the brilliant and controversial engineer Wernher von Braun, whose ambitious vision for space travel had been co-opted into the war effort. Beginning in 1933, under the auspices of the German army, von Braun and his team at Peenemünde faced immense technical challenges in transforming theoretical designs into tangible results. Their ambition necessitated breakthroughs in propulsion systems, guidance technology, and aerodynamics that lay far beyond the contemporary capabilities of engineering. Most notably, the V-2 rocket was powered by a liquid-fueled engine, a radical departure from solid fuel systems, allowing for greater power and control during flight. The development of stable and effective ignition systems and fuel combinations required immense experimentation, leading to countless setbacks and the tragic loss of life among workers and test pilots in the early phases. Yet as prototype after prototype exploded in the skies or crashed without warning, the German military leadership remained steadfast in its commitment to the project, drawn by the allure of potential terror that the weapon could unleash upon their enemies. In 1944, after considerable investment and sacrifice, the V-2 rocket entered its operational phase. Initial launches were focused on targets in southern England, but the weapon quickly demonstrated its utility in sowing fear rather than achieving significant military gains. Each strike marked an unthinkable break from conventional warfare. Cities unequipped for such an onslaught were struck indiscriminately, resulting in catastrophic civilian casualties that only fueled a sense of helplessness among the populace. Unlike artillery bombardments that provided some forewarning, the V-2 rocket's supersonic speed meant it could not be intercepted, leaving civilians with mere seconds of terror from launch to impact. This element of surprise became its own socio-political weapon. As the missile struck in a blinding flash of light, buildings crumbled, lives were lost, and a single rocket became a symbol of futility, as it was equally devastating for the German engineers and planners, as it was for their intended targets. The damage inflicted upon London in particular, where over 1,000 V-2 strikes would leave neighborhoods in ruins, illustrated how the V-2 shifted the landscape of war from purely military engagements to the psychological realm, where fear ruled and uncertainty reigned. Logistic challenges continually plagued the deployment of the V-2 rockets. While the Nazis perfected the launching systems, moving these immense and bulky missiles from assembly plants to launch sites posed significant difficulties, compounded by Allied air dominance. Long supply lines stretched perilously close to front lines and were subject to bombardment, necessitating a veil of secrecy and deception that only heightened the tension surrounding the weapon's deployment. Engineers had to innovate within the constraints of dwindling industrial capabilities, repurposing factories and utilizing forced labor to meet production goals. Yet, despite these staggering endeavors, the number of operational V-2 rockets deployed in the waning months of the war remained limited when measured against the scale of devastation initially envisioned. Poor morale among German soldiers and workers, the lack of fuel and resources, and the gradual collapse of infrastructure as Allied troops advanced thwarted the V-2's potential to provide a decisive turn in the conflict. However, while the weapon was not the decisive tool of victory envisioned by its creators, it did leave indelible marks on the course of history. The psychological impact on both soldiers and civilians was profound. The fear instilled by the V-2 contributed to the broader societal trauma of war. For soldiers on the front lines, the knowledge that their families back home could be victims of these ominous strikes created a stark, unsettling parallel of life during wartime. Despite being one of the most advanced weapon systems of its time, the V-2 represented a culmination of desperation, a sign of a regime clinging to threats rather than hopes for victory. The terrifying strikes highlighted the grim reality of modern warfare, revealing how technology, while promising, could also usher in unprecedented terror against civilians that were meant to be safeguarded by the laws of war. Ultimately, the narrative of the V-2 rocket serves as a lamentation of human ambition twisted by conflict. The engineers who envisioned a brighter future of space exploration and innovation found their dreams metamorphosed into a catastrophic weapon that wreaked havoc on innocents, a reflection of how technological advancement can be perverted in the hands of those who wield it for maleficent ends. The echoes of its launches, reverberating through bombed-out remnants of Gothic architecture and shattered homes, became a grim backdrop to a war marked by both unresolved tensions and the profound loss of life. The look upon the faces of civilians in post-strike chaos told a story that transcended military victories and failed offensives. It illustrated the lengths to which humanity would go in the name of war, often at the expense of its own essence. As World War II drew to a close, and the once mighty Third Reich crumbled, the legacy of the V-2 rocket remained as an enduring symbol of the war's horror, reminding future generations of the thin line that exists between progress and destruction. As the war escalated into its final years, the development and deployment of the V-2 rocket became emblematic of both a technocratic worldview and the desperate measures taken by the Nazi regime to alter the tide of conflict. The origins of the V-2's engineering lay in the advancements orchestrated by a cadre of skilled German scientists, amongst them the formidable Werner von Braun, whose aspirations for the rocket were initially rooted in peaceful exploration of space. However, as the Allied forces steadily encroached upon German territory, the trajectory of these ambitions shifted markedly. The intricacies of the V-2's design illustrated a remarkable feat of engineering. Utilizing a vertically launched system, it had an operational range of up to 200 miles and could strike cities with relentless accuracy. Yet practical deployment faced numerous logistical hurdles. As production ramps scaled, the Nazis grappled with dwindling resources, compounded by relentless Allied bombing campaigns targeting Germany's industrial base. The factories in Peenemünde, while initially havens of innovation, came under fierce aerial attack designed to cripple German missile production. Amidst this turmoil, the ethical realities of the V-2's manufacture also emerged. Observing the plight of laborers, some of whom were forced into servitude in horrific working conditions, underscored the regime's moral decay. In deploying labor from concentration camps, including children and the elderly, the Nazis not only hastened the rocket's production, but simultaneously deepened the trench of human suffering that defined their legacy. On the battlefield, the strategy surrounding the V-2 was one of psychological warfare. Hitler's propaganda machine heralded the rocket as a wonder weapon, with ambitions to use it against major urban centers in the Allied nations, particularly London and Antwerp. The decision to launch these strikes was steeped in desperation. The hope was that the very presence of the V-2 would evoke fear and panic, potentially destabilizing civilian morale and forcing a change in Allied military strategy. As such, the strikes were timed to maximize their psychological impact, often targeting civilian areas at dusk to instill fear during times typically associated with safety and rest. The din of the V-2 rockets, with their unearthly scream, reverberated through the streets, shocking inhabitants as the ground trembled beneath them, signaling devastation. Each attack portrayed the grim statistical reality of the V-2 program. The rocket was a high-cost weapon system producing disproportionately low strategic results. By the end of its deployment, roughly 3,000 rockets were launched at cities, yet they achieved mixed success in terms of direct military gains. The rockets, intended to serve as a tipping point in the war, instead devastated cities, leading to the loss of approximately 9,000 civilian lives in London alone, without significantly altering military operations. This led to a disquieting realization among those involved in the war effort. Technologically advanced solutions do not always equate to effective military strategy. While the German High Command often drew imaginary correlations between successful missile launches and conscription of youth to a renewed resolve, the grim reality was that the war was ultimately lost through multifaceted failures that outstepped mere technological advancement. Moreover, the human cost of the V-2 program was emblematic of the broader tragedy of World War II. Every launch represented a decision fraught with ethical implications and the burden of consequence. Civilians found themselves victims of a new type of warfare, where distance and dehumanization rendered them as mere data points within strategic calculations. The haunting image of a family huddled in a makeshift shelter, expecting the comforting embrace of safety but instead finding themselves in the crosshairs of an indiscriminate bomb, laid bare the conflicts of war that transcended front lines. As the V-2 strikes continued, the psychological damage cultivated deep scars within the British populace. Psychological studies later unearthed the long-lasting effects of the terror wrought by the attacks, manifesting in increased anxiety and trauma that rippled through communities, impacting generations. The invisible enemy of fear hung over them, independent of any physical conflict. This engendered an understanding that the implications of the V-2 were rooted not merely in the physical destruction, but also in the psychosocial realm, challenging the very essence of human resilience during unprecedented times. The paradox exists where one of history's most significant advancements in engineering and physics not only showcased human ingenuity, but also exemplified the troubling depths to which technology may slide in service of destruction. As the turning tides of the war became evident, with the Allies advancing through Europe, German military leadership remained obstinate. Wasting precious resources on further V-2 development exemplified a desperate clinging to past glories, an inability to recognize the shifting realities of the battlefield. The final years of the war devolved into disarray, marked by internal strife and the collapse of morale, yet the V-2 continued to launch, consistently claiming the lives of civilians even as German forces faced disintegration. Thus, the impact of the weapon aligned with the stark tragedy of the conflict it sprang from, reflecting an analytical lens on military strategies that severely underestimated the power of resilience over mere firepower. In the closing chapters of World War II, as the Allies liberated areas once under the shadow of the V-2, the legacy it left was far from one of technological triumph. Instead, it echoed the haunting consequences of war. Deployed not as a method of defense, but as a tool of terror that reshaped the human landscape, instilling a fear that lingered long after the last rocket fell silent. The V-2 rocket stands as a sobering reminder. Innovation's brightest aspirations can be tainted when harnessed for destruction rather than progress, compelling us to reflect on the moral imperatives intertwined with human ingenuity and the harrowing legacies of conflict that persist through history. As we delve deeper into the echoes of war, consider how these monumental moments shaped our present, and share your reflections and thoughts below. Subscribe for more insight into the complexities of war's technological landscape and its profound impacts on humanity. Your voice matters in preserving this history. As the Second World War accelerated toward its inevitable conclusion, the reality of the V-2 rocket persisted as a focal point of engineering prowess mixed with a harrowing narrative of despair. Conceived by a cadre of elite German scientists led by Werner von Braun, the rocket represented the zenith of technological ambition, with capacities that transcended traditional warfare. The V-2, an abbreviation for Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2, was not merely a tool intended for conventional military use. It was a symbol of Nazi Germany's desperation to maintain supremacy in a theater where conventional tactics were waning. The irony lay in its very design. While intended to strike fear into the hearts of Allied forces, it ultimately became a scourge of civilian populations, particularly in cities such as London, Antwerp, and, tragically, various locations within Germany itself. The V-2 program's complexity extended beyond its engineering features. Its successful deployment required intricate logistics, which were frequently hampered by the deteriorating conditions of the Nazi regime. Each rocket launched demanded vast resources, fuel cells, engineered components, and precision instrument calibration, all of which were placed under strain as Allied air raids systematically targeted manufacturing facilities. The German Reich's infrastructure was crumbling under the assault, and the reliance on deteriorating supply lines introduced both operational delays and vulnerabilities. A logistics model reliant on a network of rail and road transport began to falter under the might of Allied air superiority, which rendered strategic transport routes hazardous. The themes of resource scarcity and logistics would soon come to symbolize the futility of the V-2 program, even as its launches became more frequent due to urgent demands from the military high command. In an operational context, the use of the V-2 was a calculated gamble. The military leadership believed that the rocket could breach the technical limitations of conventional artillery and aircraft, delivering payloads well beyond the reach of existing weaponry. Each rocket was launched from mobile platforms, which provided a semblance of tactical versatility, allowing German forces to relocate sites and thus elude detection and counterstrikes. However, the reality of these tactics was quite different. While the mobility of launch sites may have offered a form of evasion, the very nature of the V-2's operational requirements often placed them in proximity to populated areas that were less strategically significant but more emotionally resonant. This resulted not only in civilian casualties, but also provoked resistance among the populations that were forced to endure such assaults. As V-2 rockets soared into the stratosphere, descending upon cities with unparalleled speed and devastating impacts, up to 1,000 pounds of high explosives, the psychological ramifications became increasingly apparent. Civilians were left in a state of perpetual fear. The silent ascent of the missile made it impossible to anticipate or prepare for the destruction it wrought. As such, the tactical advantage hoped for by German commanders became an act of terror that redefined the human experience during those final years of conflict. Communities faced the crippling weight of loss and grief, with entire neighborhoods obliterated in moments, while survivors grappled with the specter of uncertainty hanging over their lives. With every passing week, as the Allies pushed further into German-occupied territories, the V-2 program transformed from an emblem of potential victory to an implementation of sheer desperation. Despite mounting losses on the battlefield, Nazi leadership insisted upon the continued production of V-2 rockets, compelled by an ideologically charged belief that these innovations could turn the tide of war. Even as the Allies liberated regions where the V-2 had wreaked havoc, German engineers and military leaders remained convinced of their strategic importance, ignoring the catastrophic civilian toll they incurred. The juxtaposition of High Command's confidence in technological warfare against the stark reality of its civilian impact laid bare a deeper tragedy, a failure of moral responsibility under the guise of national defense. As the war neared its bitter end, V-2 rockets continued to rain down on cities, yet the tactical purpose behind their continuation became ever more obscure. The emphasis pivoted from military utility toward the sinister aim of sowing discord and despair among enemy populations. By this point, it was clear that the rocket served as a convenient distraction, a means through which the desperately crumbling Nazi regime could preserve an illusion of power rather than deliver strategic effectiveness. The rockets, launched sporadically from less predictable locations, targeted urban centers where civilians comprised the overwhelming majority, thus converting the very atmosphere of life into one steeped in dread. In opposition, Allied forces recognized the need for countermeasures against the looming threat of the V-2. Tactical initiatives began to emerge, focusing on strategic bombing campaigns directed toward both the factories producing these weapons and the facilities responsible for their launch. Advanced intelligence gathering and the use of concentrated aerial bombardments became standard operations as the Allies sought to cripple the V-2 supply chain. The tactical ethos shifted toward a relentless pursuit to eliminate the rocket factories located primarily in Peenemünde and later in secret sites throughout Europe, as Allied air raids intensified in response to the continued assault on civilian populations. As the Allies honed their strategies, the psychological warfare aspect also translated into propaganda efforts, emphasizing the human cost of the V-2 program, solidifying the narrative of German mistakes, and emphasizing the fortitude of the Allied response. Yet, despite the bombardments and strategic dismantling efforts, the V-2 remained a sobering reality for civilians. The embodiment of a weapon that had transitioned into a tool of psychological warfare served as a constant reminder of the enduring toll of conflict. By early 1945, with the Reich crumbling and surrender imminent, the V-2 program became a site of internal conflict among its developers, as engineers and scientists began to grapple with the very purpose of their innovations. Doubts intensified within the ranks, marked by the juxtaposition of revolutionary advancements and the humanitarian disaster they perpetuated. The impending defeat of Germany provided no comfort for the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. Civilians who had never enlisted, who had not chosen this conflict, but who became unwilling participants in its harrowing legacy. Thus, as the smoke cleared from the battlefields, the true legacy of the V-2 rocket materialized not as a testament to engineering mastery, but as a haunting reminder of the depths of human suffering wrought in the name of warfare. The specter of its terror resonated throughout the ruined cities long after hostilities ceased, an indelible mark on the collective memory of those who bore witness. In this context, the technological ambitions that once promised to reshape warfare instead converged to illuminate one of history's darkest chapters, a poignant reflection on the transformation of human ingenuity from a pursuit of progress to an instrument of anguish. In the wake of the initial deployment of the V-2 rocket, military analysts and commanders on both sides of the conflict began to adjust their strategies in response to the unprecedented aerial threat. The German military command had heralded the V-2 as the decisive weapon that would turn the tide in their favor. However, the efficacy of the V-2 was immediately marred by logistical challenges and the inherent limitations of its design. Launched from set sites often located near the front lines, the rockets required extensive infrastructure, which had become increasingly difficult to maintain due to relentless Allied air raids. The inability to manufacture the V-2s at the scale anticipated by German strategists caused a significant shift in expectations. By late 1944, production issues exacerbated by resource shortages, including a lack of high-grade fuels and precision components necessary for the rocket's sophisticated guidance systems, pushed the Wehrmacht into desperation. In an attempt to circumvent these production dilemmas, the engineers behind the V-2 program explored methods to simplify construction and reduce the time needed to launch each missile. They implemented a system of mobile launch platforms designed to increase not only the mobility of the V-2 units, but also their ability to evade Allied reconnaissance. However, this maneuverability came at the cost of accuracy. Mobile platforms were often deployed in haste, and the resulting precision errors led to devastating impacts on urban areas rather than enemy military targets. The rocket's impact on civilian populations soon transcended mere collateral damage. It began to generate a profound psychological strain on those living under its shadow. In London, Londoners experienced firsthand the terror of the V-2 as it descended without warning, inciting a palpable sense of vulnerability and dread among the population. The psychological cost of this experience was layered. Not only were civilians responding to the immediate threat of death, but they were also grappling with the unpredictability of their survival, as multiple V-2 strikes shattered lives and neighborhoods almost instantly. For military leaders on the Allied side, the emergence of the V-2 created a pressing need for a recalibration of strategy. Intelligence efforts intensified in response to the new threat. Deciphering Luftwaffe communications and strategies became paramount as Allied forces sought to understand and counteract the V-2 launches. The British conducted Operation Crossbow, a concerted bombing campaign aimed at destroying German long-range weapons, predominantly targeting factories in Peenemünde and other research facilities. The Allies recognized the catastrophic potential of the V-2 on their troops and territories, and with each successful strike on a launch site, they gained a meager psychological edge, one that became vital in sustaining morale against an increasingly desperate and aggressive enemy. As the war dragged on and more V-2s were unleashed upon civilians, the ethical implications of this technology grew more complex, challenging the historical narrative often framed by the concept of total war. The military strategy employed by the Germans, whereby civilian devastation was accepted as a means to achieve military objectives, highlighted the moral bankruptcy that shrouded the conflict. Reports from the front echoed a chilling reality. The V-2 had not merely shifted the dynamics of engagement, it had also revealed the extent to which combatants were willing to court civilian casualty. A brutal reminder that warfare often blurs the lines between combatants and civilians. To some engineers and scientists, the V-2 became an object of profound ambivalence, a manifestation of their expertise that propelled human ingenuity into uncharted, often ghastly territory. Internal disagreements rumbled within the ranks as scientists like Werner von Braun, initially heralded as visionaries, found their dreams of technological transcendence overshadowed by the ruin wrought upon innocent lives. As the last months of the war approached, military command was faced with a dual-edged dilemma: maintain the operational deployment of the V-2, which had yet to turn the tide of the war in their favor, or shift focus from urban annihilation toward a more concentrated military effort aimed at the dwindling resources in the East. The increasing complexity of this decision was compounded by the rampant disillusionment within German ranks. As the prospect of victory faded, many began to question the use of the V-2 against civilian targets that bore no direct relationship to military success. To grapple with this internal conflict, many officers resorted to framing their decisions as necessary evils in a brutal conflict where survival came at the expense of moral standing. Despite their engineering achievements, the human cost remained starkly real, as each V-2 launch marked another round in a grim tally of civilian casualties. In total, approximately 9,000 V-2 rockets were launched against Allied cities by the end of the war, resulting in thousands of deaths and injuries. Streets once alive with laughter and daily life became fragmented landscapes filled with shattered glass, rubble, and the eerie echoes of destruction. Survivors of these attacks were left to navigate the chaos of fear, immense sorrow, and the disintegration of once vibrant communities. The lingering terror of the V-2 had psychological ramifications that stretched beyond the battlefield, embedding itself in the consciousness of survivors who lived through such harrowing strikes. As the war drew to a close, communities dislocated and battered by the conflict began their long, arduous journey of rebuilding, a task compounded by the emotional toll of trauma that the V-2 had wrought. By May 1945, as the Allied forces surged into Berlin, the V-2 program stood as a casualty of its own demise, swallowed by the inevitability of defeat. The engineers who had once believed they would shape the future of warfare now reflected on a legacy mired in devastation and despair. While the physical threat of the V-2 would eventually recede into history, its profound psychological impact survived. Surviving civilians lived with the memory of merciless destruction tied to a weapon that signified not only a significant technological achievement but also a profound moral calamity. The depths of humanity's capacity for both innovation and destruction. Thus, the V-2 rocket transitioned from a harbinger of promised military superiority to a chilling reminder of the cost of conflict, embodying the fraught intersection of human ingenuity and moral consideration that continues to resonate throughout history. As the war entered its final phases, military leaders on both sides grappled with the shifting tides of conflict wrought by sudden advancements in technology. The V-2 rocket, envisioned as a revolutionary tool capable of turning the tide in favor of the Axis powers, became emblematic of both great engineering prowess and tragic miscalculation. Designed under the strict regime of the German scientific elite, the rocket was intended to deliver payloads with unprecedented precision and speed, bypassing conventional defenses and instilling widespread dread among Allied forces. Its development was a testament to German ingenuity, but this ingenuity was overshadowed by the strategic follies that ensued from its deployment. The V-2's complex trajectory, powered by liquid fuel engines, rendered it not only difficult to produce but also challenging to launch effectively under the pressures of war. The logistical demands were daunting. Each rocket required a dedicated assembly line, specialized materials, and a workforce that included many forced laborers, illustrating the dark realities underpinning the technological achievement. Consequently, as the Allies advanced through Western Europe, the V-2 program faced mounting challenges. Allied intelligence worked diligently to uncover the whereabouts of launch sites, employing a combination of aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications. Major facilities like the one in Peenemünde, which served as the epicenter of V-2 development, were relentlessly targeted. Such efforts culminated in Operation Hydra, an attack that aimed to cripple the production capabilities of the V-2 rockets. As British bombers leveled these sites, the German military found themselves at a critical nexus: dual pressures from the rampaging Allied forces and a supply chain that was increasingly strained. The reality was grim. While the introduction of the V-2 was meant to instill fear as a means of psychological warfare, it was now German forces that had begun to feel the crippling effects of resource scarcity and manpower depletion. What had initially been hailed as a means to strike fear into the hearts of enemy combatants now morphed into a desperate gamble to maintain a semblance of resilience. The tactical calculus became even more complex when considering the role of these rockets in broader military operations. With the Red Army pushing from the east and the Allies making gains in the west, the question loomed whether the V-2 program could alter the course of the war. General Walter Dornberger, head of the German rocket program, advocated for the continued deployment of the V-2, viewing it as a strategic tool that could disrupt Allied morale and slow their momentum. However, the efficacy of the V-2 in achieving these objectives proved elusive and unsatisfactory. First-hand accounts from Allied soldiers reveal that morale remained largely unchanged in the face of the sporadic and indiscriminate nature of the attacks. As the enemy learned to adapt to the unpredictable threat that the V-2 represented, as the launching pads dispersed across Belgium and the Netherlands came under constant scrutiny by Allied forces, the operational aspects of the V-2 became more ad hoc and furtive. Critically, these launch sites were often located in civilian areas, a fact that raised ethical questions about wartime conduct and collateral damage. The inherent limitations of the V-2's guidance systems often resulted in the rockets veering off course, leading to tragic consequences for non-combatants. The attacks on London and Antwerp became particularly notorious. Residents of these cities faced constant uncertainty, leading to a tragic normalization of fear. The initial dread the rocket instigated quickly morphed into hardened resilience among the civilian population. As they learned to adapt to the threat, a sense of community amidst chaos emerged, with citizens coming together not only to share their fears, but also to bolster their spirits as they sought to navigate the new norm of their war-torn lives. At the same time, the psychological toll on both the civilian population and the military personnel involved in the launches cannot be understated. For those in the bunkers and command centers monitoring the trajectories of the V-2, a sense of helplessness permeated the air. They knew their work would yield destruction, and while they hoped to defend their homeland, they were also acutely aware of the human cost. Some engineers and military leaders expressed grave reservations, anguished by the knowledge that their innovations would not merely target military objectives, but would also land in the heart of populated areas, creating a phenomenally complex moral dilemma. This internal conflict manifested in varying degrees of resistance. Certain individuals opted for silence and compliance, while others openly questioned the ethics of targeting civilian areas in a seemingly insatiable quest for victory. Humanity's capacity to endure suffering became vividly apparent as the war dragged on. Refugees flooded into cities not yet hit by the V-2 strikes, seeking shelter and solace. Each report of a rocket successfully landing and detonating in its target zone sent carnage rippling through communities, where families were torn apart in an instant. The aftermath of the V-2 strikes stunned onlookers. Lives snuffed out, homes obliterated, and an irreplaceable loss of cultural heritage as centuries-old structures were turned to dust. This wave of destruction created a new class of displaced individuals, forcing towns and cities previously undisturbed by the direct combat of conventional warfare to contend with dilemmas typically reserved for frontline communities. In the ethical hierarchy of wartime decisions, the V-2 program stands as a warning of the perils of scientific advancement unshackled from moral considerations. The engineers and military leaders who orchestrated it faced moral consequences that haunted them both during and after the war, with many wrestling with feelings of guilt regarding their contributions to what became one of the most terrifying phrases associated with World War II. As the remnants of the conflict began to fade, it was not just the physical destruction that required rebuilding, but also the deeper psychological scars left upon the survivors. Thus, the legacy of the V-2 rocket reflects the interplay of human creativity and nine-dimensional moral failing, a paradoxical reflection on how perceived advancements in warfare can lead not only to strategic victories, but also to the depths of human suffering. The aftermath of World War II ultimately forced a reckoning with these questions. As the dust settled and the survivors began the long process of healing, discussions about the ethical limits of scientific exploration and military application evolved, pressing humanity to consider volatile intersections of innovation and morality. The terrifying legacy of the V-2, at once a technological marvel and a harbinger of suffering, underscores the imperative to poison our consciousness with the memories of pain inflicted in the name of progress. The haunting reminders of its catastrophic strikes continue to resonate, challenging future generations to consider the broader implications ahead as they navigate the uncharted waters of human ingenuity. If history has taught anything, it is that the advancements we herald may sometimes come at an incredibly high cost, demanding from us both innovation and a profound consideration of the morality accompanying each scientific leap forward. As we reflect on these multifaceted narratives, we invite you, our audience, to delve deeper into the intricate layers of this and other historical events. Subscribe for more insights on the human stories that shape our existence, and share your thoughts or suggest themes you would like us to explore next. The propensity for innovation continues to shape our destiny, and together, we can examine the lessons history has to offer. As the war progressed into its later stages, the shifting tides of conflict in Europe would also lead to unrelenting advancements in technology, specifically within the realm of weapons systems. Among these, the development of the V-2 rocket by German engineers became a focal point of both fascination and horror. Designed as a retaliatory weapon, this groundbreaking piece of technology marked a prominent shift in the landscape of warfare, propelling notions of modern rocket science that would leave an indelible mark on military tactics and international relations. However, the immediate impact of the V-2 was as much about psychological warfare as it was about physical destruction, igniting a profound fear among civilians and illuminating the desperate measures employed by the Axis powers as their fortunes waned. The first successful test launch of the V-2 rocket occurred in 1944, marking a significant milestone in the Nazi regime's armament campaign. Conceived under the ambitious guidance of Werner von Braun and his team at Peenemünde, the V-2 represented not only an unmatched combination of speed and range, capable of reaching altitudes of 189 kilometers, but also a chilling embodiment of Hitler's vision for striking at the heart of enemy cities. The engineering behind the V-2 was revolutionary. Utilizing a liquid fuel propulsion system, the rocket's ascent was marked by a thrust-to-weight ratio that made it capable of carrying a warhead weighing up to a ton across distances of over 320 kilometers. This combination of power and precision redefined strategic bombing and signaled a horrifying new chapter in the fight for supremacy. As Allied forces gained ground, the German military's desperation to maintain a formidable presence prompted the launch of mass attacks targeting urban centers in Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately London. At its zenith, the V2 campaign aimed to instill terror in the civilian populace, exerting psychological pressure that the Nazis hoped would fracture civilian morale and spark a broader discontent within enemy nations. The timing of the launches became a calculated endeavor to interrupt daily life. The very randomness of a V2 strike became a weapon in itself, amplifying fear and uncertainty. Civilians, who were already grappling with the harsh realities of war, now faced the looming threat of an unseen missile silently falling from the sky. A new wicked form of warfare that rendered defenses nearly impotent. Despite its technological stature, the operational deployment of the V2 rockets elucidated the logistical difficulties faced by the German military. The extensive production required vast resources, and by mid-1944, Allied bombing significantly hindered the ability of German factories to generate the components necessary for the V2. The sheer complexity of integrating the various elements of the launch infrastructure also proved harrowing for the German army. Firing platforms had to be stealthily constructed and relocated to evade detection by Allied reconnaissance. Challenges in the coordination of transport, ensuring fuel supplies, and the safety of personnel further strained an overstressed war apparatus. Every launch represented a fierce gamble that strained dwindling resources at a time when the tides of war were decidedly against Germany. As the V2s rained down on cities in targeted regions, the terror and devastation inflicted upon the civilian population were nothing short of catastrophic. The rocket strikes typically took place without warning, with the unique sound of silence preceding their descent, punctuated only by the deafening explosion that followed. This gnawing unpredictability led to widespread panic, as people learned to live with the cold dread of an ever-looming invisible enemy. Casualty reports swelled. London alone endured over 1,400 V2 attacks, claiming the lives of more than 2,700 individuals, and injuring an additional 6,500. Images of crumbling buildings and ravaged neighborhoods painted a harrowing picture of a city under siege, reflecting not only physical destruction, but the deep psychological wounds that would take generations to heal. In conjunction with the strategic, tactical, and psychological constants influencing the V2 campaign, the human cost of its implementation loomed enormous in terms of morality and ethical considerations. Thousands of forced laborers were conscripted from various countries occupied by Nazi Germany, including concentration camps, where they faced grueling working conditions in the assembly facilities. These individuals, deprived of freedom and subjected to horrific treatment, became collateral damage in the regime's insatiable quest for technological superiority. This sobering reality further complicated the narrative surrounding the V2. It was not merely a weapon of war, but a symbol of ethical compromise, born out of desperation and deadly ambition, resonating within the architectures of violence spanning from military leaders to innocent bystanders. As the war reached its climax, reliance on the V2 rockets did not change the outcome of battle strategies. Rather, it illustrated the profound disconnection between military innovation and its efficacy in shaping the broader scope of the war. Although the launch of these rockets was intended to turn the tide, the reality was that the Allied powers, fortified with their overwhelming resource capabilities and coordinated strategies, continued their advance. The effectiveness of the V2 was undermined by the inability of the Axis powers to sustain a coherent combat strategy in the face of superior opposition. The inevitable collapse of Nazi Germany in 1945 left a trail of devastation across Europe, a haunting testament to the price of war. In the aftermath, scrutiny of the V2 rocket intensified. Analyzing its success and failure became paramount, exposing the juxtaposition of technological prowess against the backdrop of moral failure. Post-war Allied investigations sought to understand its engineering and applications, leading to a complex legacy that not only informed the Cold War arms race, but also set the stage for modern space exploration. However, it was the recollection of the trauma experienced by countless citizens that dominated the narrative. From the debris-littered streets of Verrall to the charred remains of London, the memories of terror would haunt the victors as much as the vanquished, demanding a reckoning, a contemplation of how progress had come to exist side by side with human suffering, forever altering the fabric of warfare and international ethics for generations to come. The chilling legacy of the V2 as a weapon of war underscores significant historical questions about the implications of technological advancement within a militaristic context. The juxtaposition of human ingenuity and ethical degradation continues to challenge modern society, prompting interrogation of the technological pursuits that ultimately shape our world. As we consider the ruptures and recoveries born from this pivotal moment in history, the haunting understanding that innovation, when untempered by morality, may lead not only to remarkable achievement but unimaginable suffering, remains a critical reflection for all future endeavors in science and warfare. As the war transitioned into its final phase in the late 1940s, the deployment of the V2 rocket reflected a broader strategic desperation within Nazi Germany's military hierarchy. Engineers boasted that the rocket, with its unmatched speed and range, would become the decisive weapon that would turn the tide in favor of the Axis powers. Yet, the reality was more harrowing than theorized. The technical sophistication of the V2, derived from the ambitions of pioneers like Wernher von Braun, clashed starkly with the logistical and operational realities on the ground. Despite its capabilities, the V2 did not serve as a fulcrum for victory on the battlefield. Instead, it became an instrument of terror, primarily aimed at civilian populations, further deepening the wounds and scars of warfare that would echo through history. Developing and deploying the V2 required an immense mobilization of resources and manpower, exacerbated by already strained German supply lines. The complexity of its production involved hundreds of thousands of laborers, many of whom were subjected to brutal conditions in underground factories like the Mittelwerk, where components of the rockets were manufactured under the watchful eye of Nazi overseers. This site, carved deep beneath the Harz Mountains, became emblematic of the lengths to which Germany would go to realize its technological aspirations. In the mad scramble for dominance, ethical lines were blurred as slave labor became the backbone of the V2 project. Such practices highlight not only the moral failings of the regime, but also the eerie juxtaposition of advanced technology emerging from a system steeped in human rights violations. Strategically, the V2 rockets were launched from mobile platforms, designed to evade Allied aerial reconnaissance and strikes. This unconventional approach allowed the German military to unleash attacks on cities such as London and Antwerp with little warning. Each strike resulted in significant civilian casualties, with thousands killed or wounded in moments of mere helplessness, bringing the horror of aerial bombardment directly to urban centers. The psychological impact of the attacks was profound. Londoners lived under the perpetual threat of death from the sky, a state of terror that permeated life and ground morale into dust. The V2's ability to strike at the very heart of cities diminished the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, a characteristic that would define modern warfare's evolving ethical landscape. On the operational front, German command faced insurmountable challenges that rendered the V2 strategy less effective than envisioned. As Allied forces closed in on German territory, the launch sites became increasingly vulnerable to airstrikes. The sheer audacity of launching such advanced weaponry from the heart of a besieged country did not go unnoticed. Allied intelligence rapidly adapted. Through a concerted effort involving monitoring and reconnaissance, Allied forces targeted known V2 launch sites, making it increasingly difficult for the Germans to execute their rocket strikes. The front line, which had seen countless battles throughout the war, became a theater of evolving tactics, embodying the chaos of a deteriorating military landscape juxtaposed against the rapid technological advancements of the V2 program. Simultaneously, the diminishing returns on their investment profoundly impacted German leadership decisions. The continued expenditure on the V2 rocket program, diverting precious resources from replenishing ground forces and defending against advancing Allied troops, raised crucial questions about strategic priorities and military focus. The German High Command's conviction that the V-2 would shift the war's momentum blinded them to the harsh realities unfolding on the ground. As these weapons fell upon civilian populations with tragic regularity, the strategic calculus of terror became one of futility. The rockets bred further hatred and resolve among the Allies, while exposing the inner failings of a regime locked in its twilight struggle. The final deployment of the V-2 rockets in the waning months of the war saw their usage also shifting according to Nazi propaganda needs. The frequency of attacks ramped up as desperate attempts were made to portray V-2 launches as a sign of German technological superiority, despite the reality of impending defeat. These launches, however, increasingly found themselves more often the focus of counter-battery fire than achieving tactical objectives. The Allied forces, well aware of the psychological power of the V-2, began to leverage this knowledge, rallying their troops and civilian populations in the face of such indiscriminate strikes. But the tragedy of the V-2 story extends far beyond its immediate usage during the war. The post-war reckoning during the denazification of Germany brought to light the unspeakable conditions under which these rockets were built, and the human cost behind their operation. Many of those who had developed the technology found themselves in the Allied crosshairs, interrogated not just for their roles in the development of the V-2, but also for the ethical considerations that had been ignored in the pursuit of military advantage. The apprehension of key figures, such as von Braun, who would later play pivotal roles in the American space program, emphasizes how technology intertwined with morality throughout history, grappling with the consequences of its uncontrolled advancement. The trauma inflicted on civilian populations by the relentless V-2 campaigns birthed a legacy that would linger long after the weapons themselves had fallen silent. Memorials across cities like London, emphasizing the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity, stand as poignant reminders of the price paid during that dark chapter. As time marched on into an era marked by the Cold War and technological race for space exploration, the lessons learned from the V-2 experience provoked serious discussions regarding the morality of scientific advancement in the shadow of warfare. The horror of those late-night rocket strikes on defenseless neighborhoods served as grim reminders of warfare's capacity to impact civilian lives, pushing society to confront ethical considerations of new technologies as civilization sought to harness these advancements for exploration rather than destruction. Technical prowess, while celebrated in the realm of engineering and innovation, cannot be decoupled from the human tragedy that accompanied the development of such war machines. The V-2 rocket, initially heralded as a marvel of engineering triumph, ultimately crystallized into a harbinger of terror, displacing the very essence of warfare as it stood, a complex interplay of moral degradation, human suffering, and the relentless pursuit of advancement without ethical consideration. The echoes of this period compel society to navigate the thin line that separates artificial innovation from its potential to devastate, forever altering collective consciousness as it reflected on the costs of progress born from violence and fear. Amidst the rubble of war-torn Europe, the German V-2 rocket represented an unprecedented leap in missile technology, ushering in an era of long-range artillery that was both feared and revered. Developed under the auspices of the Third Reich, the V-2 combined advanced rocket propulsion systems with systematic engineering, and although its creators claimed it would turn the tide against the Allied forces, the subsequent impact on civilian populations underscored a complex web of overreaching ambition and moral vacuity. The operational details surrounding the V-2 deployment reveal a tapestry of technical challenges, strategic decisions, and human suffering, painting a sobering portrait of the era. The design, spearheaded by Wernher von Braun and his team, utilized a cutting-edge liquid-fueled propulsion system that set it apart from conventional artillery. With a range exceeding 200 miles, the V-2 was capable of reaching targets far beyond the front line, inflicting pain and destruction on cities like London and Antwerp. The intricacies of the launch process reflected the ingenuity of its design, but were also indicative of the desperate conditions under which the technology was being operationalized. Each rocket, weighing nearly 29,000 pounds and packed with a 1-ton warhead, required a specialized launching pad configured for its intricate launch procedures. The actual launching sites, such as the infamous V2 launch sites in the Netherlands, were heavily guarded, yet their mere existence was a testament to Germany's burgeoning missile research capabilities. Operationally, the V2 program suffered from a mixture of logistical hurdles, particularly as Allied forces applied mounting pressure in the latter stages of the war. The initial successes of the rockets were mired in inefficiencies. The scarcity of resources, such as fuel and funding, became pressing issues as the war drew closer to its end. These challenges were exacerbated by bombings aimed at disrupting manufacturing facilities and launch sites, compelling German commanders to adapt their strategies swiftly. They relied on mobile launch units designed for rapid deployments, incorporating camouflage and subterfuge to evade detection. The tactics employed revealed a commitment to maintaining the V2's operational capabilities in the face of dwindling support and encroaching enemy forces. Beyond the technical aspects, the human infrastructure behind the V2 was fundamentally flawed. Local labor, including forced laborers from occupied territories, was harnessed to meet the insatiable demands of the war machine. Yet the conditions were appalling. Poor working environments, coupled with the constant threat of Allied bombing raids, contributed to a grim atmosphere that stoked resentment among workers. The personal narratives of these individuals often highlighted conflicts between survival and complicity. Engineers who understood the destructive potential of their inventions found themselves entangled in a regime that saw worth only in annihilation. These moral dilemmas, encircled by an overarching quest for military superiority, often resulted in tragic repercussions that resonated deeply within civilian populations, leading to existential blows resonating through families torn apart by loss. Tactically, Germany's reliance on the V2 rocket marked a point of contention among military strategists. While high-ranking officials, intoxicated by the prospect of a wonder weapon that could shift the balance of power, advocated for its deployment, many on the front lines questioned the effectiveness of such an expensive and resource-intensive initiative. The military staff on the ground expressed concern that the V2s were misaligned with contemporary military strategies, where immediate infantry and ground units needed support, rather than the abstract concept of striking terror behind enemy lines. Additionally, the evolving nature of warfare highlighted a growing reliance on air superiority and combined arms tactics, leading to further questions about the wisdom of channeling scarce resources into an unproven rocket program. The impact of the V2 rockets unleashed a wave of psychological terror that stretched beyond the physical damage. The haunting wails of air raid sirens soon transformed into a constant reminder of the vulnerability faced by civilian populations. The V2's capacity for stealth, a consequence of its high-speed ascent and trajectory, which often rendered traditional air defense systems ineffective, factored heavily into the strategy employed by German forces. Civilians found themselves on edge, paralyzed by the unpredictability of life under bombardment. The familiar cadence of everyday life shattered with each incoming rocket, which often struck with little to no warning, resulting in an atmosphere of pervasive fear and hopelessness. Moreover, the V2 assault exposed the inadequacies of existing defense measures, leading to an urgent reassessment of air raid defenses in Allied cities. Extensive civilian casualties, including children and the elderly, underscored horrific outcomes that cast a long shadow over the effectiveness and moral framework of the bombing campaigns. Families, often torn apart in instant explosions, navigated a landscape marred by urgency and despair, desperately trying to piece together lives irreparably altered by the rain of steel and fire falling from the sky. The social fabric was irrevocably damaged, as an entire generation grew to understand the harsh realities of war, ingraining into their consciousness the fears of death and loss. As the war progressed toward its catastrophic conclusion, the V2 rockets, once heralded as the spearhead of a new era in warfare, exemplified not just the ambitious heights of technology, but also the profound lows of human suffering and moral ambiguity. Each launch contributed not to military glory, but rather reinforced the hopelessness that permeated the civilian landscape. Ultimately, as the Allies captured the V-2 facilities and researchers, the focus transitioned from wartime production to a future where the ethics of science and technology would face renewed scrutiny. The legacy of the V-2 rocket became entangled with reflections on progress versus destruction. Its once magnificent capabilities turned into dark reminders of how the relentless pursuit of technological advancement could yield technologies capable of not only reshaping warfare, but annihilating myriad lives in the process. The epoch forged by the V-2 signifies not merely a chronological delineation of historical events, but serves as a contemporary call to interrogate the moral foundations underlying scientific inquiry, threading the lessons of the past into the fabric of future aspirations. As the V-2 rockets transitioned from theory to reality, the logistical and tactical challenges faced by German engineers were monumental. Conceived by a pioneering team under the direction of Werner von Braun, the rocket epitomized the zenith of wartime engineering. Initially dubbed the Aggregate 4, the V-2 represented a leap forward not only in rocket propulsion technology, but also in the integration of advanced aerodynamics and guidance systems. The vehicle's development was marred by political pressure from the Nazi regime, which demanded rapid outcomes amid an increasingly desperate military situation. The ramp-up to production was characterized by severe resource limitations, compounded by Allied air raids that targeted manufacturing facilities, such as those in Peenemünde, and later at various underground sites, forcing engineers to adapt constantly to the shifting war landscape. These challenges necessitated a series of compromises that would ultimately influence the effectiveness of the V-2 in combat. The strategic deployment of the V-2 was underpinned by a harsh reality. The Nazi military was losing ground. By the end of 1944, the war had taken a volatile turn, with Allied forces steadily liberating occupied territories across Europe. The impending collapse of the Third Reich intensified the urgency surrounding the deployment of the V-2 rocket. German commanders, desperate to wreak havoc on Allied morale and infrastructure, sought to employ the missile not merely as a weapon of war, but as a means to demonstrate to both civilians and soldiers that Germany still possessed the technological prowess to influence the outcome of the war. However, the decision to deploy the V-2 rockets against civilian targets represented a significant shift in military ethics, marking a departure from previous conventions that distinguished between combatants and non-combatants. This tactical choice was not only driven by desperation, but also a willingness to incorporate terror as a psychological weapon, underlining the moral degradation that characterized the later stages of the conflict. The V-2's operational use began in September 1944, with strikes aimed at London and later expanded to include Antwerp and other critical cities. Each launch, while heralded by the German military as a potential turning point, instead revealed the technological limitations of the rocket when confronted by a landscape of urban resistance. These missiles, engineered to reach altitudes exceeding 100 kilometers and to travel at speeds of over 5,160 kilometers per hour, faced significant challenges related to targeting accuracy. The sophisticated guidance systems, despite their innovations, were often thwarted by the complexities of urban environments, leading to collateral damage that frequently exceeded expectations. Instead of crippling military infrastructure, many rockets found their targets amid civilian populations, reflecting the grim irony of what was purported to be a technological marvel. Each strike that failed to achieve strategic objectives further illustrated the misalignment between military theory and the brutal realities of urban warfare. In the crushing fog of war, the human cost of the V-2 campaign remains a haunting testament to the inner workings of conflict. Civilian casualties were staggering, with thousands instantly killed or maimed by the unexpected detonation of these rockets. Unlike conventional bombing that would give inhabitants a brief moment of forewarning, the V-2 struck with terrifying swiftness, erasing lives and homes in an instant. The haunting shriek of the missile as it broke the sound barrier was often the last sound victims would ever hear, shattering the tranquility of everyday life and leaving behind a trail of destruction that engulfed entire neighborhoods. Survivors who picked through the rubble found not only the remnants of their homes, but also evidence of lives irrevocably altered, families torn asunder, and communities irrevocably scarred. The psychological ramifications were profound, as fear became a constant companion for those who lived in the shadow of the V2. The illusion of safety morphed into a pervasive dread, manifesting in the minds of civilians who became acutely aware of the thin veneer that separated them from death. The discourse surrounding military strategy began to shift as the brutality of the V2 campaign unfolded. Commanders on the Allied side swiftly recognized the necessity of adapting their response to this new threat. The evolution of countermeasures became paramount, leading to the development of tactics aimed at mitigating the capabilities presented by the V2. The Allies initiated extensive aerial reconnaissance operations focused on identifying launch sites while simultaneously ramping up their own technological innovations. Experts in radar and early warning systems were recruited to develop effective measures to intercept or divert missiles before they could reach their intended targets. This iterative engagement illustrated an adaptive warfighting mentality as each side strived to outmaneuver the other in a grim technological race. As the final months of the war approached, the direct legacy of the V2 campaign came to signify not just an epoch of innovation, but also one of ethical questioning. The German reliance on the V2 as a psychological weapon raised uncomfortable questions about the extent to which technology could be harnessed for inhumane purposes. With each launch leading to devastation, the moral frameworks underpinning military engagement grew more tenuous. Allied leaders were confronted with their own ethical dilemmas, grappling with whether retaliation should escalate into broader strikes against German cities. As the conflict drew nearer to its inevitable conclusion, the bombings of Dresden and other German cities elicited vibrant discussion surrounding the morality of their action in comparison to the indiscriminate targeting of civilians by the V2. Ultimately, the surrender of Germany in May 1945 concluded the immediate threat of the V2, but the implications of its technological advancements lingered on for decades to come. The tools of war developed during this tumultuous time began to be repurposed for scientific advancement in the era of the Cold War, as former German engineers and scientists found themselves recruited by the United States and Soviet Union amidst a new geopolitical landscape. The pursuit of the V2's designs not only underscored the complex dynamics of technological progress, but also served as a cautionary tale about the dual-edged nature of scientific innovation, particularly in the realm of warfare. In retrospect, the V2 represented both human ingenuity and a harrowing descent into a moral abyss, which would take generations to come to terms with, encapsulating a critical reflection on how the collective aspirations of humanity could be tarnished by the misapplication of its greatest achievements. The legacy of the V2, therefore, rests not solely in its technological brilliance, but in the vital necessity of interrogating the ethics that must accompany scientific advancements to prevent history from repeating its darkest chapters. As the war raged through the early months of 1945, the psychological toll of the V2 rocket on the civilian population of England and the Netherlands became increasingly evident. Allied forces struggled not only with the physical destruction wrought by these technologically advanced missiles, but also with the deeper implications of unrelenting terror that gripped cities like London and Antwerp. Each launch meant 60 seconds of anticipation mixed with fear, as sirens would wail and civilians rushed to find shelter, far removed from the battlefield yet inexplicably at its mercy. The V2's capacity to reach targets with a high degree of precision marked a new epoch in warfare. It did not discriminate between soldiers and civilians, transforming the home front into an extension of the conflict. The V2, developed under the leadership of Werner von Braun at Peenemünde, was originally heralded as a weapon that could change the dynamics of the war. Operation Paperclip, a secretive American project recruiting German scientists after the war, ultimately underscored the complexity and duality of this bidirectional relationship between scientific innovation and ethical consequences. Yet, in the face of the German military's sheer ambition, Allied command could only respond in kind with its strategies aimed at neutralizing the V2 threat while maintaining a semblance of order on the home front. To combat the growing menace of the V2, the Allied command initiated a multi-pronged response, emphasizing not only military fortification, but also intelligence gathering. British intelligence assessed the situation and determined that the V2 operations were centralized around secretly built launch sites. Precise reconnaissance missions became paramount. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command intensified its strategic bombing campaign, targeting suspected V2 launch sites throughout occupied Europe, employing techniques that incorporated both high-altitude bombing and low-level assault profiles to ensure success. The effort, however, was fraught with difficulty. The V2 sites were typically located in rural areas, camouflaged against the landscape, making them elusive targets for the Allied bombers. The RAF's 5, 7, and 8 bomber groups were tasked with these dangerous missions, often facing anti-aircraft fire and the threat of Luftwaffe fighters. The situation heightened the already dire stakes for pilots, as the V2's sudden appearance in the skies over British cities initiated new levels of risk and urgency in the sky. Pilots trained rigorously for these missions, but the raids over the heavily defended sites saw losses mount, both in terms of aircraft and personnel. As attacks on these launch sites continued, the operational requirements dictated by Allied commanders became increasingly complex, as they aimed to limit collateral damage while disrupting the continuous stream of rockets being launched against urban centers. The increasing hostility between Allied forces aiming to disrupt V2 operations and Axis defenders reflected broader themes of the war itself, as the lines became blurred between military and civilian zones. German engineers, emboldened by their successes and ever more desperate, adapted tactics for V2 launches, taking them off established sites and mobile platforms to ensure their defenses could not preemptively shut them down. This adaptability added layers of difficulty for Allied reconnaissance and bombing runs, leading to a necessary pivot in strategy that included counter-battery tactics and the use of radar systems aimed at intercepting the missiles once airborne. Moreover, the implementation of Operation Crossbow sought to respond to the rising tide of destruction brought by the V2s. Tracking systems were developed to identify and locate these rockets during flight, allowing artillery and anti-aircraft forces to engage them with a measure of effectiveness. This was an evolution in battlefield tactics. The V2's trajectory was tracked with high-tech devices, and fast-moving artillery units engaged with the projectiles mid-flight. However, these measures proved insufficient against the sheer speed and altitude of the V2 rockets. For every temporary success, dozens of civilians were left mourning the loss of loved ones, displaced or injured by the indiscriminate nature of the bombardment, a dire irony that stemmed from a weapon intended to focus warfare. Journalists and newspapers carried stories of suffering, framing the impact of the V2 within the broader context of moral questioning. Reports from London painted a portrait of devastation, with neighborhoods in ruins and communities shattered, families torn apart, lives irrevocably changed. The emotional resonance of these narratives captivated the public's attention, making the V2 a symbol of German inhumanity, and painted a stark picture of what technological advancements could beget in the hands of an aggressive regime. Yet, the press largely ignored the implications for the engineers who had designed such devices, often painting their ingenuity in a purely negative light without a deeper consideration of the ethical dilemmas they faced. Within high-ranking military discussions, the ethical ramifications of escalating retaliation weighed heavily. As German cities fell under intensified Allied bombings in early 1945, commanders wrestled with decisions that could exacerbate the suffering brought on by the V2 strikes. The dilemmas concerning collective punishment and the potential for further civilian casualties loomed large. In this desperate phase of the war, the highs and lows of military command dynamics came into glaring focus. Decisions had to be made whether to target V2 facilities outright, rush into more comprehensive aerial campaigns, or adopt measures of restraint in an effort to maintain the moral high ground. The escalation of warfare through indiscriminate targeting further highlighted the debate surrounding the strategies employed against the V-2. The German response to these bombings would often come in the form of desperate retaliatory strikes, leading to V-2 launches with increasing frequency as the conflict reached its climax. By April 1945, archival records indicate that the pace of V-2 launches surged, suggesting not just a military tactic, but a psychology aimed at breaking the will of the Allied populace. The psychological warfare component was essential to the campaign. The terror induced by the V-2s was a calculated tactic meant to destabilize morale at home, while aiming to keep soldiers engaged in the fight against a remorseless enemy. Ultimately, as May 1945 approached, both the geographical and psychological landscapes of warfare shifted irrevocably. Looming victories and horrific losses shaped an uncertain future for those caught in the crosshairs of war. The intricate web of technological advancement, human suffering, moral ambiguity, and strategic frictions lay bare the tragedy of a conflict where science was repurposed for destruction, marking an era punctuated by the profound realization that the quest for progress often celebrated could lead humanity down a treacherous path. With the war drawing to a close, the story of the V-2 left an indelible mark not only on military doctrine but also on the collective consciousness, illuminating the stark potential of technology both for innovation and for causing widespread suffering. In this space, a reckoning was required, one that sought to reconcile the incredible achievements of human engineering with the haunting reality of its implications.